Welcome to our latest RAD session, People Power Electoral Lessons from Around the Globe. So we really wanted to host this session with left and progressive electoral experts, narrative practitioners, and organizers from across the globe because we recognize that conservative and far right forces that we are up against are definitely not unique to the US. Over the last decade, the resurgence of fascist ideologies has really gained traction globally. We've seen it erode democratic institutions, give police more powers, violently enforce borders, and pass laws that really criminalize and control the bodies and movements of marginalized people. We also know that these ideologies are supported by dominant narratives that are more resourced, have more institutional backing, and are propagated by mainstream media in a way that is very highly coordinated. And we also know that these dominant narratives gain even greater salience during elections. So to build greater power on the left towards democracy, towards justice, towards liberation, we need to see our struggles as inherently tied to international solidarity. And we have seen that power, the kind of power that this holds from the movement for Black Lives all the way to Palestinian liberation. And so today we'll hear learnings from social movement workers in India, in Brazil, in Nigeria, and Ukraine, and understand their strategies and best practices for being able to really seed these kind of narratives of liberation. So I'll introduce our panelists. Bear with me. I didn't want to cut down on the bios because they're all really incredible and really impressive. So it's definitely worth hearing. But first, we've got Gabi Junes, who is from Brazil and is a communicator with experience in socio-environmental, pro-rights, and electoral campaigns using collaborative, creative, and humorous approaches. She founded the School of Activism and developed its learning methodologies for creative communication and effective organizing for activists. She also worked on 2 presidential campaigns for Marina Silva and other local ones as well. In 2022, she crafted the political strategy and implementation of landmark efforts to increase the participation of young people and women in elections, producing direct actions and unbranded communications materials for these campaigns. And we'll talk a lot more about 2022 later. And she is now one of the directors of Lamparina, a women-led organization that does narrative work to strengthen democratic values. Thank you so much for joining us, Gabi. Next up, we've got Iryna Tyshko, who is from Ukraine. She is a gender expert, head of NGO Public Alliance Political Action of Women, a member of the Public Council of Parliamentary MFO Equal Opportunities, and former advisor to the deputy head of the presidential administration in Ukraine. She is also the initiator and coordinator of several public coalitions for protecting women's rights, such as Elections Without Sexism and Let's Open the Truth About Violence. She is the author of the film, The One Day of the Life of a Candidate, dedicated to the political rights of women. And she is also the leader of the first public protest for gender quotas in the election law in Ukraine, and the author of many manifestos and statements against violating women's rights. Thank you so much for joining us, Iryna. Next, we've got Omoyele Sowore, who is a Nigerian human rights activist, pro-democracy campaigner, and founder of the online news agency Sahara Reporters. He has been actively involved in advocating for social justice, good governance, and the eradication of corruption in Nigeria. Sowore ran for the presidency of Nigeria in both 2019 and 2023 elections under the African Action Congress Party. And his activism has led to multiple arrests and detentions by the Nigerian government. But despite facing many of these challenges, Sowore remains a vocal and influential figure in Nigerian politics and civil society. And finally, so thank you so much. Nice to have you, Omoyele. And then finally, we've got Nisha Abdulla, who is a theater maker and educator based in Bangalore, India. Her anti-oppressive arts practice places care, curiosity, and community at the core of the creation process. She is deeply invested in exploring the interplay of identity, belonging, power, and gaze in the contemporary socio-political context. This is both in her artistic work and also in teaching at universities and other learning spaces. She is also a member of a citizen action group advocating pluralism and constitutionality, which she will definitely talk more about later. Great. Thank you all to our panelists. So we've got a lot of questions prepared, but the way this is going to go is I'll ask each of the panelists a very specific individual question that will hopefully give all of you, all of the participants, a bit more context about what they're up against and what they're working with in their home countries. And then we have a few questions, a few very brief questions for all of them, commenting on emerging themes around the far right and around politics today. And then we'll fully open it up to all of you to ask your questions. As I think Iryna mentioned, feel free to, as soon as the questions come to you, feel free to pop them into the chat, and we'll be reviewing them as they come in. Cool. All right. So I'll kick us off with the first question, which is for Gabi. So, Gabi, in 2022, you worked on the general election in Brazil, where former left-wing President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was up against the far-right incumbent Jair Bolsonaro. The election was close, but ultimately Lula won by over 2 million votes and formed a coalition with centrist parties. So tell us, what was at stake during this election? Why was it so monumental? In your work, what communities did you target and why? And how has the political landscape in Brazil developed since then, since this 2-year period of the election? So handing it over to you, Gabi.
Hello everyone. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to build this with you guys. So what was at stake? We had Bolsonaro as president. He's a Trump follower, like he has the same playbook of all ultra-right guys everywhere. And he was running for re-election right after the pandemics in Brazil, where he had a very terrible administration. And Lula wasn't the best candidate we could have. He was an old white man, and like during his past administrations weren't like perfect, but he was who we had. And we were in a moment with like especially women and youth very upset about politics. Like people are not believing in politics anymore, I think everywhere, but like our researchers in Brazil showed like the youth was like, I'm not gonna vote because I don't believe it. And at the same time, the polls showed us that women and youth were like the highest electorate for Lula. So they could be who would change the game for us during the election. And at the same time, we have like in Brazil, 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, they can vote. It's not mandatory, but you can register and vote. But they weren't registering. And 18 to 24th, they weren't voting either. Like they were the population that were voting as much as the over 70s people. So we had this huge challenge to bring women to vote because like all the polls said they were like against Bolsonaro, and they were too much at home. They were like feeling they couldn't tell their truth loud because their husbands would vote for Bolsonaro. It would become a huge fight inside of their houses. They wouldn't vote. It would be better for the family. And the youth, there was like with who we worked more in Brazil. My group actually worked more in Brazil, was like we did some research to understand why they wouldn't vote. We already knew it, but what would make them vote? And we figured out like when they register, when they're 16 and 17 and register, they really go vote. So we worked very hard to make 16 and 17 to register. They were like 6 million of the population around that. And Lula won by 2. So that was very important to us. We had a record of registering like ever. It was like 3 million youth, like very young people registering to vote, and they really went to vote. What else can I say? Like the way we did that was very interesting. Instead of like making a big campaign with the party, we decided to build a coalition we call it an ecosystem of campaigns, that everyone had their own campaigns, but we were very like organizers. We had many weavers between us working for it to happen, though we were very different doing each one of us our campaign. We had like people like me and others who were very investing their time in making people work together and spreading the news about a new campaign, making like bringing new voices, being very like building the community in a way that we showed diverse, not only that we were showing up like as one voice that we all agreed with. Instead of that, we decided to show our diversity to the country, and it was very strong. Like the fragmentation showed was very potent, and people like really we brought together the army, the BTS fandom. We brought together NGOs. We brought artists. We even brought American artists with us, like tweet this, retweet this from this artist in Brazil. So the interaction made it like very potent and in media every day. So the youth, they were feeling like, I'm missing something, that like something big's happening. It's historical and I want to be in that. So we really make that feeling happen. And what's been happening since then? Like Lula was mainly elected by women, Black people, youth, and working class, which you can kind of put together. And the first things he did was like he delivered a lot to these populations, like during the first 3 months. And after that, he has to work with the center or the slightly right parties, so he can manage to have a healthy administration. By doing that, he has been putting his administration, our politics in Brazil has been putting women and Black people in the waiting room again. Like, it's not the best time for you to come up with this demand because it's going to bring Bolsonaro back to the game. It's always this kind of ghost of Bolsonaro behind us. As Lula won by too little, it's the ghost is really big and they have a lot of power in politics. And I think what we're managing to do now is to bring more voices to break polarization a little bit, because when we go to polarization, we make like the ultra right very strong. When we break polarization, we are able to grow progressives. We're able to grow like lefties, or we're able to grow people who really want diversity. So that's what we've been doing now, like to bringing new voices and trying to take out the tag of the political tag of all conversations. So we talk about like reproductive rights in a way that's about our lives, our health, not about politics. It's like kind of the opposite we have done during like the past 10 years.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabi. As you were talking, I was just reminded of how in Poland last year we managed to get the far right Law and Justice Party out, and it was mostly like queer and trans communities, abortion rights campaigners, women, and it's been 10 months and we have yet to see the full legalization of abortion in Poland. So definitely still in the waiting room. Nisha, I'll go to you next. So in addition to being a theater maker and educator, you're also engaged in electoral organizing, having worked on both state and national elections. And while there was a wide-scale grassroots resistance, Narendra Modi, who is a far-right Hindu nationalist, was this year elected to a third term as Prime Minister of India. What were the ways in which grassroots organizations and civil society worked together, particularly in engaging young people and women, which seems to be a thread based on what Gabi said as well? And how are you preparing to take these strategies forward, especially considering that India has more state elections that are scheduled for later this year?
Thank you, Marzena, and Gabi for going first and kind of setting the tone. I also want to just start off with saying hi to everyone for being here, for being interested in something like this. It's great to see that this kind of narrative building across a transnational context is also something that piques people's interest. Glad that the RADCOMS network is doing this work. Is so urgently required. I also want to say that I'm not affiliated with any party. That's important in my context to state. And I also want to say that it's really impossible to bring India's election experience. It's such a mammoth task to 5 minutes and one person. So what I'm giving you is really the very top of the sort of pudding, as they say. So the question that's often asked is that, if Narendra Modi came back with the far-right government, then what really is it that the lefts and the progressives and civil society is really celebrating in India? Well, really, the context is that because just like, everywhere else with the far-right, because, the government deals with or controls so many of the media, so much of the institutions. The fight really this time was felt very much like we're on a brink of something worse. And so the fact that now we have a broad-based coalition of anti-fascist, anti-far-right parties sitting in opposition, countering both the far-right lawmaking and the far-right narrative. That is something. It means that the democratic backsliding that we saw, the very dramatic democratic backsliding that we saw in the last 10 years, that's been arrested to a small extent. We're beginning to see democratic processes kind of breathe again, and it's giving a lot of us some breathing space. The news is still full of marginalized folks being sort of sacrificed at the altar of Hindutva politics. That is very much real, but we're also beginning to see the beginnings of a real counter. Where this will go, of course, depends a lot on the next few months, because like Marzena said, there are state elections around the corner, and that will really test the grip that the Modi regime has on the country. So in this climate, when government agencies and medias are all kind of willingly giving up their roles as protectors of democracy, the fact that we had large members of civil society, NGOs and grassroots organizations, student groups, artist collectives, independent media across languages and geographies, independent fact checkers and researchers and think tanks, all of these forces really, whether they were big or small, kind of came together to counter government propaganda. And they did that with numbers and facts. And these kind of really snowballed into something larger. And the truth is that right until the first phase of the elections, because we had a long drawn 7-phase elections across more than 2 months. And even after the first phase, there was still a kind of a lull. But all of this work that had gone in really kind of synergized over the second to the fourth phase, really. That's when we really saw all of it kind of kicking in. And so while there's always this sort of never-ending blitzkrieg of government narrative that was kind of top down, and it's blasted into our TVs and our phones, what was happening parallelly was there's a countering of all of that on the ground in very diverse ways, very dispersed pockets. And many of these pockets were not even talking to each other, because the magnitude of campaigning or election organizing or any kind of organizing in India it's such a large task that it's impossible to be talking to everyone. But what really helped this was a kind of narrative clarity that had come through by them. And that narrative clarity really depended on two kind of sides, really, of the same coin, which is secularism and social justice. And when I say secularism here, I just want to point out that it's the Indian secularism, which is the equality of all religions under law and not the separation of religion and state. So Indian secularism is a big part of kind of trying to take this mammoth, diverse country, forward, and it's kind of coded into the constitution. And it's exactly this that was attacked by the Hindutva politics. So the fact that this ideological clarity came through, and it came through from grassroots movements which were led by minority and marginalized folks, Indian Muslims, Adivasis. Adivasis are the indigenous folks, the queer folks who were really attempting to break through hegemonic kind of dominant narratives when it comes to Hindutva and cishet narratives, and all of it was led by these folks, by rural folks who were really struggling to find jobs, and their standard of living had collapsed in the last 10 years. The fact that this civil society, grassroots striking on secularism and social justice as this two-pronged strategy, it forced the opposition to play that game. Because this is an opposition that often mimicked the Hindutva forces, that mimicked the far-right forces. And so when they saw that this mimicking was not giving them electoral results, the fact is that they had to listen to what was on the ground. And so things like across parties, women workers came out to speak to other women voter profiles, to say, look, this is what the Hindutva regime does to women. And it doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what kind of polarizing narrative the government feeds you. These are the ways in which indices have fallen. These are the ways in which crimes against women have increased. And this kind of a strategy was followed even for youth, where youth camps often focused on constitutional rights and the kind of legal rights they have to demand jobs, food security, health, as opposed to the kind of false narratives that were being fed to them. So this ideological clarity really kind of tethered the multiple diverse pockets of communication and resistance that we saw. I can speak more about this later, but I've run out of time, so yeah.
Thank you so much, Nisha. I think it really highlighted the importance of setting the counter narrative from the grassroots, as opposed to being kind of in reactive mode and developing narratives that, kind of, like you said, mimic or respond to the dominant narratives or the hegemonic ones. Great, thank you. So Omoyele, my next question is for you. So you have worked on several fronts related to democracy, from activism and journalism to actually running for elected office in Nigeria. Can you give us an overview of how social movements have developed in Nigeria over the last 12 years? I'm thinking particularly about Occupy Nigeria, about End SARS, about the impact of Black Lives Matter, and how have these social movements mapped onto democratic engagement? And then finally, what opportunities do you see ahead during the 2027 elections?
Well, thank you guys for inviting me once again. I listened to great speakers before me, and it's also very interesting to hear diverse views and opinions about what has been going on in other continents are very, very similar to ours. But in our own case, the sad part is that you guys talk about elections. I've heard people talk about elections in India. You talk about elections in Brazil. And I've followed so many of these recent elections. My own country, Nigeria, we haven't been able to have what we call elections. There is a semblance of one, considering that they declare a day for people to come out. And usually before that, a lot of people are excited about registering to vote. In the last election, As a matter of fact, there were over 82 million registered voters, of which, for the first time almost in the history of Nigeria, women voters equaled, women registered voters equaled or more, they were more than men voters. And as a candidate, I was saying to women that, if you could register to vote, why do you keep queuing up behind all these failed men who have failed your country? Get a candidate who is female. Vote, all of you, vote for that person. For the first time, let there be a female president. But that's the conversation for another day. But what has happened, which is the question I'm asking, is, where did the social movements of recent time emerge from? And like a colleague from India did say, there's a whole lot of mimicking of what we see outside, especially with Occupy, Occupy Wall Street, which somehow, with the help of social media and a platform like ours, got filtered to Nigerians, and they felt, we could do something similar like this because we even have worst cases of oppression and economic problems here. And that was how that happened. But what is great about this is that each time Nigeria takes this idea from elsewhere, when it gets on the ground, it's always bigger. I think Nigeria probably had the biggest Occupy movement in 2012. And when there was Black Lives Matter, it occurred to them that they could also deal with police brutality in Nigeria. And then there was NSAS in 2020. But what has happened, which is very important to note, is that the political class in Nigeria somehow have figured out how to perch on, the outcome of these social media, social upheavals, and take advantage of them. And when the protests are over, when these revolts are over, the political class either hides in the corner or jump out of wherever they are, and they start leading the pack. So they are smart enough to understand that after every social revolt, there will be some kind of shift politically from the existing order, because people are always thirsty and hungry for a new order. And they're very quick, very savvy to jump in the front of it, probably at the back of it, and take advantage of it. So after Occupy Nigeria, there was a whole political change in Nigeria. The existing political party at that time, the People's Democratic Party, lost election, which has never happened in Nigeria's history, of a transition of party from one party to another party under a democratic electoral system. But it did happen, and it sounded credible. It looked credible. And then the same thing happened in 2020. After NSAS, another political group, this time a fresh one, jumped in front of us. As a matter of fact, they never participated in NSAS, but they were smart enough to take advantage of what they've known to be the grievances of young people, and they rode on the crest of that wave. So it then became a little bit difficult for these social movements to fight the battles because they're not politically organized, and probably conscious enough to understand that it's not just enough to fight, but there is a path from protest to power. It is what has been absent in our own political, our political or social movements. And this is the reason why people like me get involved in politics. I used to hate politics, like probably every one of you. I used to deny that I would never have anything to do with political partisanship. But I did it as an activist, as a student activist, brought about democracy, left Nigeria in 1999 when these political hyenas took over our country. 2012, they took over in 2015. So in 2018, I said, you can have the best media in the world, but they actually can't change society if good people don't get into office. So I got into the ring and discovered that they not only have mastered the art of manipulation, but they are good at manipulating in such a way that even those they are manipulating because of the weaponization of poverty would accuse to the manipulation. They would defend it. It was like, oh, yes, we know Mr. Sowore is good as an activist, but he doesn't have an experience as a politician. And what is experience? The capacity to still rob, manipulate, rig elections, perpetrate violence. That is what is political experience in our own part of the world, or suppress women or minority groups in the country. So this struggle has not stopped for those of us who want the country to be good. And that was what led to, when we were planning this, I told you we're planning another protest, which lasted for 10 days, Days of Rage in Nigeria. And it went successfully. In fact, that's probably the reason I was unable to participate in so many of the preparation for today. So if I haven't precisely spoken about what you wanted to hear, please, you got to pardon me, because we are planning another one for October. The thing is, we are not stopping, but it is important to just key in here, for those who might be listening who hear about Nigeria all the time, that we have to do some self-reassessment to say, look, when you fight for liberty, for progress, development, prosperity, you don't just quit the stage and allow the vultures who took you to the place to take over the success of your struggle. So that's where we are. But we continue to organize, and we must say, and which is where I want to stop here, that we are influenced by, the Nigerian political system is not different from the US political system. It's not different from the Brazilian political system. It's not different from the Indian political system. Nigerian political leaders or rulers love it when they hear that the next president of the US supports torture, that he supports all kinds of corruption. They love to hear that, the Indian prime minister is somewhat a bigot. It was like, yeah, can't you see we're not alone, They love to hear it when they're breaking into the Brazilian presidential, office, because the guy who was there before was an idiot. I was like, yes, we're not the only idiots. See, they have them in Brazil too. So, but we want to move away completely from this kind of terrible mirror images of rulership and leadership around the world, to create a perfect situation for ourselves and to take advantage, and not opportunistically now, but rightly, of organizing that captures power in such a way that power can be used for public good, as opposed to being used to oppress or cause widespread depression in our society in Nigeria. Thank you, and I yield. Hopefully, I addressed some of your questions adequately.
Yeah, thank you so much, Omoyele. You pulled on so many important threads, including the kind of difference in the kind of power that you build through mobilization, but how that doesn't always translates into the kind of political power that you actually need to govern. In addition to like the threats of co-optation, how governments, how conservative or far right forces actually can co-opt the very messages that come out of our social movements, and how to be on the lookout for that. So thank you. Iryna, I'll go to you next. So Iryna, you have spent much of your life fighting for democracy and for women's rights, working both inside of the Ukrainian government and also on the outside through NGOs. In the current context of Ukraine, particularly after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, what are the biggest threats to democracy? How are those in civil society actually organizing to ensure that far-right and national groups do not gain power after the war? And just a flag on translation. So Iryna, you will be speaking in Ukrainian. So all of the participants, just make sure that if you don't speak Ukrainian, you have the interpretation setting onto English.
Так, дуже шкода, що
Yes, it's a pity that I'm the only one who speaks Ukrainian. Good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this high level of organization, March. So thank you so much. It's awesome and sensitive for us, and for me personally, it is very important. So air raid has just
finished. We don't have power. We are using a power generator, but we do everything possible for the world to hear about our experience, how we fight for freedom and democracy. And we want our language to be visible. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And my experience in civil society and in the government was all about my values, because it doesn't matter where I work, the values of democracy, liberty, and solidarity, that's what I always have, and that's the reason why we are all here in Ukraine, and that's what we are fighting for. And I remember my first events, big public events, at the beginning of 2000s, when Russia invaded Georgia. We, as young activists, we went to Crimea to block the Black Sea Fleet and to say that Crimea is Ukraine, not Russia. This was my first experience. And I don't know how much you know about Ukraine, but what is important to know that of 33 years of our independence, not Ukrainians spoke about Ukraine. And we need to keep emphasizing that our history with all the speakers who presented, like, we have a lot of similarities, because we have the last anti-colonial war in Europe. And you need to understand that we are fighting not for the territory itself, but for the existence of our identity. And it doesn't matter that I am in civil society now. Our country is a territory of big freedom, and civil society has huge impact. And I was engaged into development of operational plan, action plan of a governmental strategy for gender equality for 2027. So we are very optimistic planning for 2027, but I would like to say that my personal identity, my national identity is influenced by our history and history of women movement. And we celebrated our Independence Day just a week ago. We are 33 years old of this independence, and we call it as recovering independence, because you know that for many centuries we didn't have our state. For many years we were not a sovereign state, and empires around us tried to split us, but our fight for us finally became successful in 1991. And this year we are celebrating 140 years of Ukrainian feminism. And I can be proud of my sisters, because they realized that women's movement of Ukraine is a part of the national movement, which was important, fighting for our state. And my role model in Ukrainian feminism is a politician and diplomat Milena Rudnitska, who in Soviet Union created famine in 1933. She came to the League of Nations and she asked this big organization to help Ukrainians provide humanitarian aid and to notice this huge tragedy. The League of Nations didn't respond, and we know how they ended.
I want to underline that I am proud of the history of the women's movement in Ukraine, and it shows that we have a right to call for the solidarity. I really thank people around the world who support Ukraine. We can stand because you stand with us. it is important for us to emphasize that Ukrainian democracy is a young democracy, and if not for the Russian aggression, we would have parliamentary elections, and last autumn, we would have presidential elections. And I think that for the first time in the history of Ukraine, we would have the biggest share, the biggest percentage of women in the Ukrainian parliament, because starting from 2019, we have a new electoral code with the 40% gender quotas, which was our demand at the parliament. I personally organized these campaigns. We were asking for 50% of gender quotas, but the result that we got was 40%. And if we had these elections, if they happened, we would have 40% of women in the Ukrainian parliament. Now we have only 20%, but we are not able to have elections because we still have the war going on. We still have the martial law. Of course, we cannot guarantee the security for the elections, and a big part of the territory is occupied now, so it's hard to speak about the elections. About the far-right movements, I want to say that usually Moscow was speaking on behalf of Ukrainians, creating this image of Ukrainians as some wild people, provincial people, nationalists, as they all always said in the Western world, in the Western media, that we are wild, we don't know what to do with this freedom that we got, and that we we do not really understand what we are doing in our politics. And there was this imperial narrative that Ukraine is a wild country of nationalists. But this is a fake, and it is shown by the results of elections, because in 2019 we had a candidate from the far right party running for the president, and he got 1.6% only. And also in 2019, we had an ultra far right party, and their support was just like 2% among the voters. So for many years, for many times during the elections, Russian influence was a huge problem that we encountered. And when there were some attempts to radicalize us, there was a strong resistance in Ukraine. I'm sure that you know that we had several revolutions in our country speaking against radicalism. So I really hope that this war will end, we will win, and we will have elections.
Great. Thank you so much, Iryna. It's so you pulled on so many interesting threads, especially about narrative, and the kind of perceptions the quote unquote West has of so many, countries that are considered non-Western. And I've been actually doing a lot of research recently about the foothold that far-right parties have gained in a lot of Western European countries. I mean, we see this with the Netherlands, with France, where we're getting upwards of 20-30% for election outcomes for the far right. So it's kind of ironic how that narrative ends up being spun. So thank you so much for your reflections. I'm going to move on now to a few questions that I'm hoping we can keep to all the panelists, that we could try to keep it to 2 minutes so we could get through all of the questions. And I put these together as kind of threads and trends that emerged from speaking with all of the panelists individually. So the first one, because this is RadComs, the first question is really about dominant narratives. So at RadComs, when we talk about dominant narratives, what we really mean are the kinds of collections of stories and messages that uphold the interest of dominant groups or ideologies, right? These could be stories about gender roles, these could be stories about family, about religion, about immigration, about economic realities. So for each of the panelists, what dominant narratives are you seeing and hearing in the political context of your home countries? And then how are activists and organizers fighting back against them? So I'll change up the order a little bit, and I'll maybe start off with you, Nisha, this time.
I think one of the critical dominant narratives is around caste in India. The Hindutva empire is built on the edifice of the caste empire. Without the caste empire, the Hindutva empire kind of collapses. And so, to maintain their stranglehold on power, the maintenance of caste is critical. And so, the anti caste narrative that is being built up through popular culture, through media, independent media, through just voices in the margins that are being more and more sort of pulled into any and all kinds of centers that we're able to. This is a critical element. Politically, this has meant that even opposition parties are responding to this anti-caste narrative by demanding, population census on the basis of caste, so that there can be a rethink on how affirmative action, land rights, just power and capital can be redistributed. Again, these are things that we've sat with as an independent nation for almost 80 years now. But for the first time, it seems like a bunch of things are coming together in that fight, including political power, because there is representation now at multiple levels, social capital, for sure, and also cultural capital, and definitely more moneyed in this space than there was before. So the anti-caste narrative for sure, and this kind of intersects with multiple other constructs of power. For example, intersectional feminism, very important to bring in the caste narrative there as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Nisha. Super concise, super interesting. Iryna, let's go to you. So same question, what dominant narratives are you hearing right now from Ukraine, and how are organizers and activists fighting back against them?
Ви знаєте, у нас все, звичайно, пов'язано з питанням безпеки.
In our country, everything is linked closely to the question of security now. But I think that every crisis is always a chance to change the narrative, to change the point of view. And it is important that I see that LGBT movements are actively participating in the national discussions, because now we talk a lot about civil partnerships to be introduced in Ukraine, and it is important that there are many men and women in the military in Ukraine from LGBT community, and they demand to legalize their relations in legislation. And for us, for our community, it is a strong discussion that we take part in. But of course, what our concerns are is this idea to change the reproductive health and rights of women. Like there was this initiative that if people do not have kids, they will pay more taxes. So this initiative was aimed to address the demographic crisis. So it was one of the initiatives, but civil society criticized this initiative a lot, and this draft law, it was abolished. Also, it is important for us to talk that women in the military, they need to receive uniform for women and all the protection means specifically for women. This is a discourse that we also have in Ukraine these days. Besides, for us, it is important to talk about like prohibition of uh, prostitution or like sex work, because we understand that the current situation in Ukraine can lead to the growth of poverty, which can lead to many women engaging in prostitution. And we were talking about having an advocacy campaign to support women, to inform them about the threats that they may face in this regard. And as for the question of religion, we have this problem and this narrative of influence of Russia. Like, I'm joking always that I hate this patriarchate, especially the Moscow patriarch. We Ukraine tries to avoid the influence of the Russian church in Ukraine. And also there are a lot of narratives about men and women serving in the army, because though it is mandatory only for men, but many women they joined the armed forces, while not all men are ready to join the armed forces of Ukraine. So it leads to people revising the traditional gender roles, because we see that their realities are different. They are not like these traditional roles we are used to.
Great, thank you so much for those reflections, Iryna. So Omoyele, we'll go to you next. Just very briefly, what dominant narratives are you hearing right now in Nigeria, and how are organizers and activists kind of counteracting them?
Can you hear me now? Good. Yes. Yes. So, I mean, we are in the middle of a social upheaval, politically, socially, and economically in the country. As I told you guys earlier, we just had a August Days of Rage, which is similar to what happened in Kenya, and another one is being planned for October 1 to last for as long as possible. So what you hear from the Nigerian government is really simple. One is that every act of challenge against the government has security implications. So national security keeps coming up as their own dominant narrative, and this seems to be something that's been planted in the minds of even an average person. Even the poorest person in Nigeria sometimes will come out unconsciously, not consciously all the time, even though there are people who are recruited on the social media angle to go out there and just do that. Unconsciously, people have nothing to lose. We'll be telling you that, a peaceful protest will lead to chaos. It's going to burn down the properties and properties they don't have. And then the government comes in and clams down on people and claim that right now the most dominant narrative is that any form of protest in the country will lead to regime change, and people are plotting to overthrow the government. And you know the implication of that. They will charge people for treason, even though they have no evidence for it. They get judges to issue ridiculous court orders, get detention orders against persons, freeze accounts. So that is where we are. We are back in that era of absolute dictatorship in Nigeria. How we are countering it? We're using social media a lot. But as most people know, the best way to conscientize the public sometimes is to engage in social upheaval. And that will make a lot of people learn faster than some 10 years of classroom consciousness, ideological immersions that people sometimes like to talk about. And I think that is helping out a lot, that we keep saying, look, we don't care what you think at this point. We care about the future of our dignity and our freedom as a people. And that narrative is being helped a lot by social media, because we also, like most of you, we have a problem with the mainstream media and how so many of them have been bought over. Several of them are actually owned. The president of Nigeria owns one of the biggest one of the biggest media companies in Nigeria. And that's the story for several countries around the world. And the ones that don't own have relationship they embed with those who are in power for, of course, both political and economic gains, financial gains. So that's where we are. We're using social media a lot to tell our stories. But all of you also know that now there are limitations to how social media companies also permit use of their platforms for social movements. With the case of Facebook, and I've not seen that much on Twitter, but I think it's a matter of time before that also creeps in there. But they have become also the new colonial masters, telling people what to say, how to say it, and what they tolerate and what they cannot tolerate on their platforms. So that's what we're doing so far.
Thank you so much, Omoyele. So Gabi, I'll go to you next, and then given the time, I'll probably start taking some questions from participants. So if you all have questions, just pop them into the chat. And if there aren't too many questions, then I'll be just continuing with some of the other ones that I have. So yeah, Gabi, same question for you about dominant narratives.
In Brazil, like from the pandemics on, the population has lost a lot of economical power, and like kids are less educated, women are more at home, and like we have really lost a lot of economical power, and that's really affecting families. And the main narrative is the new liberal narrative. Like it depends on you to win against this. Like you're poor because you didn't work right, or someone has gained a lot of money because he did it right. So and also like this affects a lot of like the government decisions, because they have to decide on like how to raise or lower the bank interests, and like it's all about this and not about how much the government should invest in like programs. And we've been working mainly with women there, talking, because we know that women have like defend governmental programs because they're the ones who use it more. So, and they know it. So if we talk to women about keeping a program, they will agree with it. So does the government should the government invest more? Like they would say yes. So we've been working more with women to approach this, like to raise investments from the government instead of do the new liberal playbook. And I think I agree that with Omoyele that like the platforms have gained a lot of power in our countries. I think, I don't know how it is in the USA, but like in the global South, the platforms have a lot of power and no responsibility at all, because they don't follow the legal rules in our countries. Like Twitter is about to maybe be banned in Brazil, and I really hope it does, unfortunately, because they really are ruling elections. Like we have local elections now, and they have a lot of power in this. We don't know how the algorithms work. We have crazy candidates working only on social media. It's been a huge thing.
Thank you so much, Gabi. Yeah, there was actually a really good rad session a little while back about specifically racialized disinformation and how it travels across a lot of platforms as well. So I'll go to a few questions. So Nisha, this one is specifically for you from Sundeep. Do you feel there are any untried or new narratives to take on the far right in the upcoming state elections in India?
Oh, what a great question. Sorry, I seem to have missed that. New narratives. Okay. There's a few that I think there's like a lot of potential for that perhaps we should see more of. One is definitely something around truth and accountability, because the last 10 years, the Hindutva regime has gotten away with, well, like all fascist regimes, with just taking away our trust in just fact and just the truth. And so numbers that come out of government agencies and forecasting for the future and numbers about how many crores of millions of Indians have come out of poverty or have gone back into poverty. Child nutrition rates, every and any number that comes out of government agencies is now under it's questionable. And so I think there really needs to be a broad-based narrative that's built around just the pursuit of what these truths are and the accountability, for not having access to these truths. I think that would go a long way in being able to bring faith back in the democratic process again. Because in the last elections, we've been seeing rather in the state elections and in national elections, the faith in the electoral system having dropped with some pretty credible instances of the opposition accusing the government of fixing votes. And so that's something that probably the other thing that immediately comes to mind is there is a huge unharnessed narrative around women and their direct impact on policy, direct impact on just material and very tangible lived reality of people. We're seeing that there is recognition of women as a voting bloc, and the recognition that they are not a monolith that is coming through. But perhaps there needs to be a very direct kind of narrative building where women are being talked to and with and listened to as citizens who have a direct impact on policy. That is, I think, still missing. They're still being spoken to as adjacent to, for example, youth or men. But there needs to be, more directly towards women. That's what I can. But what a great question! Thank you for that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Nisha. I think it's what you're saying is particularly interesting vis-a-vis how just in general, gender has been weaponized by far-right groups. I think one of the things that I noticed more when I was initially speaking with all of you, working in seemingly very different national context, was how much this weaponization of gender, this construction of gender as an ideology was prevalent across so many different conservative and far-right groups, and how it particularly came up in kind of the scapegoating and the demonization of LGBTQ communities, but not only, women of abortion rights. We won't delve into that question as it was, many of you kind of answered threads of it. Chanel, I see your questions and we'll go to them in a sec. One question I have for you all, because it feels rare to have a group of people who are working on similar issues using in many ways similar tactics and strategies in such different contexts. But one question I have for all of you is, we recognize that conservative and far-right groups, also in that context, imperialist powers, are so much more organized, have so much more money and influence than progressive movements actually do. So my question really is, what infrastructure, what do we need to create to build international solidarity and power on the left? So how do we stop thinking beyond just our individual countries that we're operating from, and really start thinking about international struggles and international solidarity. I mean, we've seen the incredible movement in the wake of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people. How do we continue to build that kind of international solidarity? So I'll open it up to any of the panelists who would like to jump in. Iryna, go for it.
Thank you very much. In reality, yes, what makes them different from us, that they have hierarchical structure, how they build their relationship inside their movement. And it's their advantage, but also their disadvantage. We need to understand that. It doesn't mean that we need to copy this patriarchal hierarchical system, but it's obvious that we need to develop inside our environment leadership, and we need to build our cooperation through frequent and open dialogue. Obviously, we need to allow the community to build their common ground with those who they see as possible partners based on values. And I understand that far-right movements, this hierarchy, when they lose a leader, it stops working. And it's very important that we have advantage because we are so horizontal. If we build a horizontal leadership and we prepare the speakers and leaders and narrative practitioners all around the world who will speak to the world through values, identity, and through democracy and liberal democracy. I think we can achieve a lot, and we have good opportunities there. And so what is common between Benedict XVI's Russian Nazis, Ukrainian far-right, Trumpists, and conspiracy theorists? They understand that gender is some kind of ideology which threatens traditional society, because at the beginning of 2000s, the Pope started the war against gender, and he stated that that's the end of human history. And that's how it started. And obviously, that in Ukraine, we have those who play to this narrative, who scare people with word gender. I would like to remind you that for 11 years, we couldn't ratify Istanbul Convention because there was the word gender, and the church interfered. Not only Ukrainian church, but Moscow church, Russia organized really big campaigns, expensive informational campaigns to prove that gender is something not natural, and it's something that will destroy society, will destroy this social relations. That is something that comes from Europe, and they tried to build this split inside Ukrainian society. And of course, it makes sense to Russia, but we ratified the Istanbul Convention, and all of a sudden, all these terrible voices disappeared. But I would like to say that we are not wearing pink, like rose glasses, and we need to work a lot to explain what gender is, what gender equality is, that it's not something that you should be afraid of. And we do it using different methods. And of course, it's very important to choose the language which is understandable for your audience. So it's very important to speak the language of your audience. Thank you.
Nisha, I see you have a hand up. Go for it.
I just wanted to sort of spring off of what Iryna was also saying. And also, I don't know how much this answers your question, but I feel like we, on this side of this debate, we have to fight the urge to simplify too much. And I feel like in India, part of the reason why we're in this mess right now, and why we've almost, lost a decade to this mess, is really because there've been too much of simplification of too many of these movements, and that they're not able to, not they, I think we, all of us on this side, have not been able to effectively hold the contradictory that is present in our various movements, especially in India with the intersections of caste and gender. We haven't been able to hold that. And with that, with the refusal to deal with that, really comes this urge to simplify further and further and further until until these narratives, these things that we're trying to even communicate hold no meaning anymore, until they become nothing really for too many people. And part of what we've seen in the last year has been the beginnings of that. We're beginning to see that it is possible to communicate more complex ideas of pluralism, in language, in symbolism, that is real and that is local to us. Bringing back the Constitution as a symbol of what we should be pursuing, as opposed to the Hindu nation where Hindus are first, right? So to be able to hold multiple contradictory kind of truths and narratives within a simpler symbology. Some of these things I think we need to really actively learn. Of course, we know that resources and putting people into a room, we know that these are things that get us there. But more than anything, I think it needs a little bit of paradigm shifting, a little bit of reframing, perhaps, and just not shy away from this task of complicated narratives. Yeah.
It's a really interesting point, Nisha, because I think sometimes we try to emulate what the opposition is doing, right? Which seemingly has an easier job because it is getting to the most base simplicity. I'm gonna pivot to Chanel's question, as we have 10 minutes left. So I'm hoping we can get through Chanel's first question and then close out with just a quick reflection on the US presidential elections. But so Chanel's first question is a really good one. So if each of you were to offer guidance or advice to future dissenters, to future social movement workers on how to build narrative power for a democratic and just future, when you draw on your own unique experience and perspectives, what advice would you give people? What advice would you give to future generations of leaders? Yeah, Gabi, maybe we could kick off with you and just do a quick, please, 1 minute.
I was looking at Chanel's question, actually. Great. What I would say is like connect to the concepts, all conversations, bring it back to talk about families, because this is most of people's world. Let's talk about the family, the school, their work, not about like the whole world as we often do in the social movement. Let's bring back to the private conversation. And because that's where the fear narrative is. And also go to where people are. Instead of bringing them, come see my campaign, let's campaign where people are. If they're going to the streets, if they're going to a concert, if they're going to the hospital, let's go where they are and talk to them there in a very familiar way.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabi. Omoyele, over to you. What advice would you give to future, or movement workers in general, about how to build narrative power?
Well, I think it's important to look into what will be the nature of power in the future. and that what we are contending with now is state power, largely controlled by all the nuances of state, religion, economic power, corporations. But I imagine that in the nearest future, the power narrative we have to also shift to individual power, corporate, not corporate power as you have now, as in corporations who hold annual general meetings that you can barge into. But considering what I said earlier, that the most powerful set of people that are coming in the future are not likely to be corporations or government, because there's now decentralized power. There will be individuals that are more powerful than corporations, and you have the billionaires already, and somebody was, I think Chanel was saying, in a multipolar world, have you thought about how to fight people with bipolar disorders who are powerful and wealthy? That's one of the things that I contend with, like apart from governments, presidents, but we're also having, uh, individuals who are so powerful now that we better start thinking about how they will how to fight them in the nearest future. But in closing, because I have to run to another meeting, it's important because I live in the US too, that all of the issues that are going to confront humanity in the future also rest largely in the decision-making process of countries the advanced countries, as we call them, even though by their conduct and their ways, they don't sound advanced, they don't behave advanced, but that's how we see them. And this leads me to the earlier question you asked about how social movements can interact, across board from, those who are in the advanced countries to those who are in the global south or wherever part of the world you might be or you are classified. And I think it's also important to start thinking equality among social movements across the world. So that, if something comes from India, you see it as important as something that comes from Nigeria. And you do not prioritize, the oppression of Indians over the oppression of Rwandese people, or you do not prioritize the importance of a particular social struggle over another one, because everybody might be under the yoke of a struggle that could lead to their own genocide in the nearest future if we don't intervene equally, lend them the kind of help and support we have, because we get that when we go to conferences. It's as if the global social movement also behave the same way. They pay more attention to, the big bucket issues, and then they leave, the global South people. Like, we're always in the AOB section of your meetings. It was like, any other business? Oh, Nigeria, you're still there. Kind of. So it's important that we start to look at equality even within the global social movement structure, so that we can understand, so that we who need the solidarity, we understand that you're actually asking for solidarity, or you are giving us solidarity, as opposed to behaving the same way as if, oh, we're just trying to help you. So that's where I will end my submission today, and thank all of you, because I got to run to my next meeting.
Thank you so much, Omoyele. It was a privilege to have you join us today. Good luck at your next event. So yeah, this will be our final question. We'll continue this question, but go to Nisha, you, and then I think Iryna are left to answer. But yeah, what's your advice for future movement workers on building narrative power? What advice would you give? So Nisha, maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, I'll keep it really short. Your collective, or the group that you work with, is really the microcosm for the world you're imagining. So if you're not able to frame power differently, if you're not able to bring diversity, true diversity, into the room, if you're struggling with conflict within the room, it's going to be very difficult to extrapolate that into the world that you're imagining. So, like, really pay attention to who's in the room, what they're saying, how you're listening. I think those things have taught me more, and the frustrations of that has taught me more in my work. So pay attention to that. Yeah.
Brilliant insight, Nisha. Thank you for bringing that into the space. So Iryna, over to you. Close us out. What advice would you give to future movement workers on how they could build narrative power?
To be honest, I was thinking like global to local, and I thought that it is actually a difficult question because the world is so diverse and there are many different ideas. There are many different movements in the world. But it seems to me that in our community, the benefit that we have and the thing that can protect us from a dictatorship is these horizontal links that we have and also our critical thinking. So, building communities, this is what we do now in Ukraine. We try to engage people, engage women based on their values. And this is an interesting experiment because I had a communication school for women leaders. And I was afraid that we will not find anyone because women will not be interested to hear about feminism, about politics, about gender equality in such difficult times. But the values they are still important. So we were able to show what our values are, and it works. Maybe it is kind of a miracle, but people do feel it. They feel that other people have the same ideas, the same dreams, the same values. And with those people, you can form small but strong communities. And usually, this world is based not on some huge unions or communities. Usually, there are these small groups of people who are passionate about what they strive for, and they can have an impact. So I call all of you, and I would call the future activists and organizers who would take on this leadership role. I would ask them to think about solidarity, build horizontal links, and create these small but strong communities.
There's a beautiful note to end on, Iryna, a call for all of us to organize from the grassroots. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us, and huge thanks to all of our speakers, to Gabi, to Nisha, to Omoyele, to Iryna for taking time to participate in this discussion because we know they're so busy doing the work that they're doing on the ground.